Hey, welcome to the Rain and Morale podcast. So, do you ever feel like screaming out in the office, on Zoom, or outside the school gates? For the love of God, come on, really? Then, if this is you and you're looking for an honest, fun, and frank podcast on life and business, then sit back and listen to me, Rain and Morale. I'll be bringing great people on the show to talk, share, and debate their life experiences and business challenges, keeping the show unpolished, but in a fun and unique British style, with sarcasm, tenacity, maybe a few swear words or tears. This podcast keeps it real, honest, raw, and removes the bullshit in the only way I know how, through authenticity and getting shit done. Think of it less like the Housewives of New York or Towie with the lipo and drama, and more like the house lives of the real world. I hope you'll take something away to be better informed, laugh, smile, or maybe even finally getting the confidence to shout, come on, really. So enjoy. Hi, good morning, Kasper. Welcome to the Rain and Morale podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. So for the listeners, I'm delighted to welcome Kasper Bjorkskov to the show. Kasper's actually at work at the moment, so I know you can see in the background some people busy working away. And he's currently about an hour ahead of us here in the UK, but we've both got our cup of teas and we're ready to go. How was yours coffee?
I have coffee.
I was going to say, you're in Europe, it's going to be
Yeah,
coffee.
exactly. It's the coffee.
Excellent. Well, as a very brief introduction to Kasper, I've been following Kasper for quite some years now on LinkedIn, and Kasper's background or education actually was as an architect with the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. So you're thinking, okay, what's that got to do with planetary boundaries? But his professional career is very much focused on a passion and deep commitment for all things environmental and social responsiveness. But as part of that is trying to understand the concept of things like planetary boundaries, alternative hedonism, which I really want to talk about, and obviously the principles around degrowth. That can flare up a few concerns in a lot of people's minds. But essentially, you've worked, and in the last sort of 6 years, working on projects like Reduction Roadmap, Living Places, and Urban Villages. So, about taking this theory practical into actual real life examples. How do you translate that into everyday for everyone to understand? And so, your 6 years kind of experience at the helm of research and design at Effect, but that's actually spelled EFFEKT,
Yeah.
has combined lots of things around client science, regenerative economies. So lots of big words there and lots of
Yeah.
things that we've kind of covered, but essentially you're really passionate about the concepts of sustainability, social change, and alternative hedonism. So welcome to the show. Thank you so much. Um, let's dive straight in. What do
Yeah.
you mean by alternative hedonism?
Alternative hedonism is actually a term that I think Kate Sapora, which is also a UK-based writer, wrote about in a book called Post-Growth Living that I recommend everyone to actually read because it's an amazing book and it really sort of highlights how we can actually achieve a better way of living in a world that isn't focused on growth. So alternative hedonism is basically teaching, it's trying to tell us how we can unlearn that enjoyment and fulfillment is through consumption and instead focus on joy and fulfillment and happiness through all the things that matter to us, sort of relationships, family and friends, and all these things, rather than just focusing on what we can buy. And I think it's such a wonderful way to explain that we can actually have a better life. Because if
Yeah,
you really think about it, then all of our choices, or most of our choices in this system, is based on us trying to accumulate more wealth rather than accumulating more relationships or healthier relationships. So I think alternative hedonism takes that sort of and flips it on its head and
right.
says, what is actually a good life? And we know for a fact that a good life is having sort of strong, close relationships, spending time with family and friends, having experiences, all of these things that we, remember when we are on our deathbed,
Yeah,
but we totally forget while we live. So, I mean, it's actually just a sense of saying, try to figure out how to live a life where this matters more than the material world.
Okay, super. And I guess I've read a couple of post growth and growth to limits to growth and things like that over the last couple of years. And I think one of the things that has always resonated with me is actually a few decades ago, literally, when I was traveling after university, being in parts of the world where I would come back and say, oh, they've got nothing, but they're so happy and it's amazing and they share everything and there's just no stresses. And I guess deep down, that has always internally stuck with me. And I've been constantly trying to emulate that, but within this system of, I've had corporate jobs and, I've got a mortgage and I've got children and, Jesus, I've worked in marketing, convincing people to buy more of what we're selling. So it's I really struggle with that shift, especially when you go back into the books and you go back into history around capitalism and controlling markets and price demand and all of these things, because it's really a system that's set against you.
Yes. No, but it really
Sorry,
is.
that wasn't very cheerful, was it?
No, but I think it's a good point, and I think I also think that there's a point in that if you understand the crisis, then you shouldn't be cheerful, and you should actually be grieving. But from that grief process comes action and hope, and I think that's what we all need to go through. And I think that's also a process I've been through, saying that okay, this is it's a really sick system that we're in. I mean, I think the fact that most people go to work, including myself, actually working on projects that are actually delivering my own death sentence, I think it's really a cruel system. So my focus has been, how can we try to change that system so that we can all go to work and have our lives, so we actually make a better world, not a poorer one. So I think that's the essence of what we need to sort of understand.
Yeah.
And I'm also in debt. I also have a mortgage. So I think it's incredibly hard to escape the system. And I don't think moving into a forest makes any, it doesn't solve the problem. So it's about trying to gather collective momentum and mobilize people toward sort of actually making that system shift. I think that's the only way we can deal with it.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned a couple of words there around, it's sick and we're in a crisis. Do you think that using terminology like that is helpful for what actually essentially is, here's a system, it works really well actually, but not for the benefit of the majority or the planet? Do you think we're missing a trick? Do you think we're using the old school media tactics and we need to, like you say, collaborate and come together? Do we go as far as civil unrest? Do we, how do we mobilize? We're trying that in the UK with really slow walks and everyone's getting arrested. What's your view?
I mean, I think understanding that it takes a diverse sort of amount of voices is sort of the key. Just shouting, I'm very much one of the people that are very activistic, and I shout and I use that language, but I do it in the sense of trying to move the majority, well aware that I will never be the one invited to the table, but my voice can maybe help the people that are sort of more the moderate voices get to the table. So I mean, a long time ago I read Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is basically this idea that there's never been a successful social movement without a radical flank. So I decided 2 years ago to be that radical flank and then try to say that I will use my voice to sort of say the hard truth, completely aware that it will not make me any sort of person that will be in a leadership position ever, but I can maybe propel someone else to become it. And I think that's how I view it. I think some people play the more strategic game, the more moderate flank, and some people are the shouters, and some people are more sort of the infiltrators that are actually in the system. So I think understanding that we are all have a part to play is super important, and then not saying that there's one right way to do it, I think is equally important.
Yeah, and I guess looking at those, it's looking at the having a diverse team, isn't it? It's having the introverts, the extroverts, the critical thinkers, the creatives, the guys that can tell a story, and the women that can critically analyze the strategic planning. And I guess that's true of everything, isn't it? So why
Exactly.
wouldn't it be true in this instance? And I think where I see a lot of your posts, for example, you are able to really summarize something quite easily and then put it on on an infographic. And
Yeah,
again, it's a clear infographic, and so it's picking these different tools of how we can galvanize and share that information. You've chose a specific way, and
yeah.
it's interesting that you say, you know, you'll never be a leader one day. Maybe you wouldn't get through the doors of COP28 right now.
No, exactly.
Slam that door in your face.
Yeah.
But how do you, let's talk about some of the practical initiatives. Let's talk about, okay, so you're shouting about this, so what do we do about it? So when we talk about the reduction roadmap, living places and urban villages, give me some examples of how the listeners can learn but maybe influence within their world and their working structure.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I think that's one I've been grappling with for a long time, and even before this, I think I had like a kind of an epiphany. A while back in Denmark, a famous journalist put a post on Instagram saying that it was a post of an email she had read that she had written to her sort of boss, saying that why weren't the national media covering the climate crisis better? And then immediately that became sort of a viral thing. And then I got involved with her and a lot of other great people, and we started to make a graphic and an identity around this. And it went viral really quickly in Denmark. And it's called Clear the Front Page. It has a different Danish name. But the idea was basically that the moment that everyone can do an action very easily. So the action in this case was to share her posts and that graphic, and that to calling for the media to actually step up to the plate. It really changed a lot. So the key learning for me was that when we do mobilization strategies, they have to be simple, emotional, and actionable. And I think that was sort of a key insight, that a lot of people really want to be part of this change, but they have no clue how to do it. So by delivering sort of that message to people on social media, that they could support this case, everyone was willing to do it because it meant a lot to people to actually be part of it because they want that change. So I thought that was a really good sort of first lesson. And then with Reduction Roadmap, which is what we're doing now, we started a while back saying, okay, everyone talks about sustainability within the construction industry, but what does that actually mean? So we teamed up with scientists and industry professional, and actually also marketing experts, to say, okay, what do we need? And then we translated how fast our industry, the building industry, have to reduce its emission per square meter, because that's how we measure it in Denmark. And then we came out with that in a very simple way so that everyone could understand. And it immediately sort of, everyone was like, oh, what are you talking about? 96, because it said that we had to reduce 96% per square meter in 7 to 12 years. But all of a sudden, everyone had a clear goal. And we went from not having to talk about what was an absolute. Sustainability had been relative. So we had talked about maybe we should reduce 30%, but no one really knew what that meant, of what.
Right.
But now we had an absolute target that everyone had to get to. And then when we had that absolute number, it started sort of a rush for everyone to try to compete with each other to get as low as possible. And then we applied for some more funding to update this last year. And then we found out that basically we have very little budget left of the CO2 budget. So what do we then do? And then we knew that there were going to be talks in the government about setting a new legislation for how much we can emit per square meter. And then we said, okay, let's try to use this momentum of a very simple, actionable approach. And then we asked all the industry who would like to support that the legislation is in line with the Paris Accord. And then we gave the number for what the legislation had to be. And I must must admit, in the beginning, I thought maybe 4 people would sign up, or 4 companies. But right now, we're actually at 420 companies spanning the entire construction sector, and it's by far the biggest majority of the industry calling for Paris-aligned targets. So it's the first time in history an entire industry is actually telling the politicians to make legislation that is so harsh that it will follow the Paris Accord. So right now we are waiting on what the politicians say.
Do you think that if the politicians don't, do you think that stronghold of over 400 will just come together and go, well, we're just going to do it anyway? Or do you think the threat of the competitors being able to go out and do things cheaper will just be too strong for them to go, actually, we can't do this?
I think the second option is what will happen, and it's not because people don't want to do it, but it's because one really amazing thing that I learned with the reduction roadmap is that it was not the leadership in the bigger corporations that signed. It was pressure from inside. It was actually in many of the companies, it was like 100 to 200 people going together, signing petitions for the management to sign this. And then they couldn't ignore it. And even some of them said they would quit if they didn't sign it. Wow. And so if it doesn't go through, the management will have like an excuse not to do it. But I do however think that if it doesn't go through, we can have a much bigger discussion in Denmark now about who is actually running the show. Because if it's not the industry itself, who are then the people that are standing in the way? And that's been clear that it's lobby organizations, and that, you know, then we have to focus on bringing them down. So I think, like, no matter how it goes, and I'm not even sure that it will be a successful campaign, but at least it will have shown that there's willingness to change and people want this change. And then it also made it very clear who the actual like opponents are and who we have to fight. And I think that's the beauty of those. And I think
that's a really interesting process, isn't it? Because we're saying, you started by saying, well, actually, it's got to be 96%. I can imagine most people in any industry would go, whoa, oh my God, how on earth? So then there's this big scramble, and then maybe people start to collaborate, and then you've got this internal pressure of people going, seriously, guys, come on, there's got to be a better way.
Yeah.
I suppose if you end up going full circle and zero action happens, like you say, I hope that doesn't happen, but in a way, it's just a conclusion, a detailed conclusion, a forensic conclusion that it's kind of follow the resources, follow the money, isn't it?
Exactly.
And then it's like, so then what do we do? Like, the construction industry is huge. So just out of interest, out of the 400 odd, does that contain some big players? You don't need to mention names, but there are big players in that.
But they are all of it. They are the absolute biggest players in the industry. So
brilliant. So I was just trying to make sure it wasn't lots of little ones, but the big players were like outside of that.
It's by far the majority of employers in Denmark. So, you know, democratically, if the politician were to listen to democracy or the voices, they would totally support this. But of course, there are a few players that are very powerful that are not signed up. So
and they don't want to sign up.
No, they don't want to sign up because they would like to continue business as usual.
So let's look at that a little bit then, Kasper. So for those that want to continue business as usual, change is complex, especially when you have to change at scale and across industries and sectors. What do you then do at that point to say, how do we move forward? Because if it's always going to be the big players going, no, it's short-term interests, it's money, it's too much, what would be the next plan for you for the project, if you like?
I think it's, almost all lobby organizations are membership based, so it will be about creating an alternative lobby organization that's green to really combat the old ways. Because I think strange in numbers, if you can get the 420 to sign another organization with the same benefits, but that are actively working on green solutions, then I think you might have a chance of actually tearing down the old power structures. And I think that's what is absolutely needed. And I think in reality, I think it's insane that few companies that would like to continue business as usual are put forward, because in reality, we have like a lot of examples in Denmark where we had very harsh legislation on how much energy we could use in buildings. And when that law was put in place, some of the biggest companies today are based on that law. So, we know that when legislation is set very hard, innovation happens, and we can actually scale some, we can actually create some amazing export successes. So I think in that sense, I think that it's very like the short-term view will die out eventually. So it's about having that alternative and creating that alternative.
Yeah. And I guess as well, if the governments, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know, at the end of the day, the governments are actually in place for the people, right? Supposedly.
Yeah.
So I guess if at the end of all of this, one major sector with 400 people, they don't bring in that legislation, then that kind of tells you all you need to know, doesn't it, really?
Yeah,
Again.
yeah, exactly. Then it becomes very obvious who the politicians are really working for and where the flaw in the system is. And I think for me, that's been the biggest sort of moment. I think like everyone could have probably said that it's the lobby organization or the big money interests that are, but right now, then you have like an actual roadmap of where it went wrong, and now you can fight that existing sort of structure instead of sort of saying who are the ones that are fighting us. We don't really know, but now we made it super clear. So I think in that sense, it's a super good way to flush out the problem.
In Denmark as well, are there lots of other industries and sectors emulating this, working together?
I mean, we are actually currently trying to see if we can get it to other sectors as well, because it's actually just a methodology that can be used for anyone. So yeah, we are looking at that. However, some other sectors, like for example, farming, is a lot more difficult because there's a lot fewer players. In the construction sector, there's a lot of different voices. So you have strength in numbers, and you can gather sort of momentum. But in other sectors, there's a very few players that control the majority. So those are harder. So we would need different tactics for those.
No, absolutely. So you talked in your bio, you talked about kind of interdisciplinary learning and through some of this process. Can you help us understand a little bit more about what are those top 3 things that you've gone, like it literally felt like you've been slapped around the face, moments where you went, wow, okay, this either really resonates or this is really important?
I think like one of the early things that we realized with both doing the reduction roadmap and the other things that you mentioned is that we tend to work in silos. So all of our work methodology is it's like we do our job, then pass it on to the next, and then we sort of at the end we get sort of a product, and everyone's sort of sad about the process because we weren't really involved when the decisions were being made. So the idea of, for example, for the reduction roadmap, it was like the industry could not have done it alone, and the scientists could not have done it alone. So it was the idea of bringing together those sort of marketing meeting scientists, meeting industry, that really sort of made the whole thing work. So it's this cross collaboration that I think is really needed. So if you can ensure that whenever you start a mobilization or a process of any innovation, it's about having all the relevant voices actually be a part of the process in the beginning and throughout.
Absolutely. And I think, again, even if I reflect back on my old world as a project manager, that's exactly what you did. You had a team of people who, it was so obvious, you've got the marketing in the room, the innovation team, you've got supply chain, you've got finance, you've got, so on. And then everyone was just doing their thing against their KPI and their bonus. And it's a system, isn't it? So we come back to this system piece that, why do we expect it to be any different? Of course it's not going to be. So let's like from a construction point of view, but from a systems thinking point of view, what are some of the things that you would like to see outside of legislation, obviously? what are some of the things you'd like to see change, and what do you hope that this mobilization can bring?
I really hope that people start speaking up. I think giving people a voice would be the best thing that could happen. And I know the voice doesn't need to be a radical one, or you, as I said, you can play any sort of, but the idea of talk to your friends. If you don't want to go online and talk about it, it's fine. But talk to your parents, talk to your wife or your friends about these things, because educate yourself, figure out, try to explain what a situation we are in, because like we all have a voice, and I think we need to use it.
Yeah.
And I think it's a big issue that we are too afraid. And also, I mean, it comes with a price being outspoken, because a lot of people don't want to hear about all of this stuff. It's easier to continue in like business as usual because it's easy. But at some point, we will all be facing the reality. So please start speaking up, because at some point you will have to face your kids when they ask you why didn't you do anything, and then you can finally answer, I tried.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's an important point there you make about your voice. Your voice doesn't necessarily have to be rude, loud, aggressive.
No.
There are so many ways to communicate outside of just your voice as well. So I think that's a really, really important point. What, from your side of things, like there is a fear factor of speaking out. Like I've been learning recently just how little people are willing to put the truth out there. And I'm not necessarily talking about everyone agreeing that there's a climate crisis and we're all going to burn, starve, or drown to death. Because let's be honest, sometimes that's how it feels.
Yeah.
But like you say, most people just, like now for me, I'll say it on a recording. I get the fossil fuels, right? I get that we have to transition out and eliminate. But when you've read books like How the World Really Works, Bright Green Lies, and you look at resources and raw materials, right, for electric vehicles, wind turbines, etc., the planet only has a certain amount of materials in it, right? So that's the first issue. The second is that plastic and oil is in, I mean, geez, I've only got to look around this office and look behind you. So what I want to understand and what I want people to say is, okay, if I turned the fossil fuel tap off tomorrow, or even in 10 years, is that going to be quick enough to innovate and allow all the benefits that certain materials has given us in longevity, reducing food waste? We've got to be honest about these things.
100%. I agree. I mean, I think there's so much, as well as there is techno optimism on the upper side of the climate movement. There's also sort of a naivete in the green movement about how we can just turn off. But I think in reality, you can dismantle all of this by understanding one very basic sort of rule, which I think you also already said, is that we live on a finite planet. We cannot have exponential growth. And this idea that green growth exists, that's the only argument left for not changing. It's the only argument left. So if that is dismantled, you start to understand that we need to live within the resources we have. Yeah. And yes, you cannot stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, but you can reduce them drastically if you start understanding what you actually need to have a good life. We don't need the full flat screens. We don't need the big Tesla. We can do so much. We can have such a lot better life without all the consumption. Because yes, plastic isn't everything, and plastic should probably still be here. We just don't need to make 4,000 different types of plastic. We can maybe make 4 types of plastic and then recycle them as long as possible. So I think it's understanding that the earth regenerates at a certain pace, and we need to get down into that pace in order to live the lives. And that will be the real innovation. And I think, to be honest, I think we live in a system where we say that we got all these benefits. And it's true. It's true that, that we live longer, but we're also more unhealthy than ever before. 1/3 of the Danish population has stress.
Yeah.
half of the young generation are depressed,
Yeah.
and 3.6 billion people live for less than $5 a day. It's not a system. It's not a good system. By all means, it's a shitty system. So why not try to change it? If it both destroys our foundation and makes us sick, then what's the reason other than a few people can continue to be very wealthy? I think that's the yeah.
And I think that's a really, bold summary. If I look at, and I don't want to talk about developing or north or south, because there's a gazillion things in between, right?
Yeah.
But if I look at countries like America and UK, and we look at the health system, we look at obesity, we look at drug abuse, we look at alcoholism, we look at suicide rates, we look at all of these things, and we're going, wow, so this industrial revolution that gave us power and energy and catapulted us into these beautiful homes, and what was it worth it, whilst like you say, pretty much half of the world's population still live on less than $5. I mean, and $5 is actually being certainly generous,
It's
some
very
of them
different.
less than $1.75. So who's it working for? I think it's a really interesting observation. And then when you look at, what's your view on developing things like construction and fossil fuels and energy in places like Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America? Because we look at them as poverty stricken. They're not poor countries at all.
No.
They're hugely rich in youth, people, resources.
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
I mean, I think of course it depends on country to country, but let's say China is a pretty good example. There was recently a report that came out saying that there's more than enough square meters in China to have everyone live have a decent home. But the problem is that the construction industry doesn't work for people; it works for finance. So what's happening, for example, in China, and you also see it actually happening in Europe now, is that you build ghost cities and then you tear them down to build them again. And that's just to keep the system going, otherwise it collapses. And it tells you everything you need to know about the industry. It is not in service of regular people. It's in service of very few individuals. And I think that's in some countries like in Africa, there's absolutely needed to build housing. But we don't need to build housing like we do. We need to build actually they are the real masters of sustainable construction, because they've been building with nature for thousands of years. And we unlearned that when we did industrialization. So they are actually the real teachers for how we can do sustainable construction. So I view it in a very different way. For example, in Denmark, I mean, we have more than enough square meters to host everyone, and to have people we have one of the highest square meter rates per person in the world. So why in the world would we keep building more homes when we get fewer people? It makes no sense. So stop building new homes and start redistributing the square meters that are there, densifying the existing housing stock, and insulating them energy efficient. All the benefits you could do from turning investments from new builds to renovation would be immense. So I think it's just like looking at the system, understanding who is it for, and then trying to do the right thing. And it's actually, and I mean, I keep telling this every time I'm out giving a lecture, is that we know what to do, but no one is actually doing it. So I just keep trying to say it because I think it's very easy.
Yeah.
And of course, people will say that it's not easy, but I mean, every country, every architecture firm could tomorrow decide that in 3 years, we will only have renovation and transformations. And that would be more than enough work for us, because 50% of the housing stock in Europe has to be renovated. So, it's not like we're going to go bankrupt. We will actually be ready for like a bigger push.
I guess that's where the governments are teetering, aren't they? There's a lot of this. Well, if we don't keep, I mean, even in the UK, they keep talking about this economic growth. We've been flat for 40 years. I mean, seriously, shut up. But the reality is that they will throw things out like, well, if we're not continuing to grow and, all these homes, etc., then, what's going to happen to all your pensions? All your pensions are going to fall through. So at every stage, there's this blocker. But what I'm loving, I guess, is people like yourself and other people that I hear and see that are going, let's just take that statement and follow it through, shall we?
Yeah.
Let's forensically follow that system. And is that true? And I think that's what I really like about your posts and the examples that you're bringing. It's like going, okay, if that's what you think and your fears are, let's debunk that, right?
Yeah, I think that's very much what at least I try to do, and I'm happy you also have the feeling that's what I'm trying to do. Is that to sort of say there's so many myths, and all of these myths that we created are there to continue business as usual. So until we debunk all of these things like green growth, circular economy, it's not that. Just want to be clear, circular economy is a tool in a post-growth world. It's not a way to continue business as usual, which it is currently. So I think we are very clever, or firms and industries are very clever at trying to come up with new concepts to continue business as usual. So it's about trying to debunk them every time it's like whack-a-mole. They find a new one and then you have to hit it back. That's what I at least try to do and try to sort of get.
Yeah.
And I think this idea of growth is a super interesting thing because a UK study came out, I think it's 4 months ago, that said if we don't meet the targets of the climate pledges, GDP will shrink with 40%.
Yeah.
And GDP shrunk with 3% during the COVID crisis, and that catapulted 200 million people out into poverty. So it's a complete collapse if we don't meet the pledges. So it's just to say that you might be able to, as a company, saying like, yeah, we need growth because otherwise we can't sustain the world. No, growth is what's going to kill you at the end. So you need to figure out how to live in a post-growth world very fast.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's actually pretty easy. Just figure out what is needed for people to live,
Right.
and thrive, and then catapult your business into that. So if you have an architecture company, focus on renovation and transformation. We know we need that. Focus on climate adaptation based on nature-based principles. We know we need that. Focus on innovation. We know we need that. And you can have an amazing company from just these three principles. You don't need to do new opera houses or all of these fancy stuff. You can literally just revert to something more exciting.
Yeah. Listen, I think that's probably a wonderful place to end this session. And yeah, honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Kasper. Thank you so much for taking time out. I hope you don't get told off by the boss. Unless, of course, you are the boss. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And I hope to chat to you again, and let's find out what happened with the legislation and in the future for the construction in Denmark.
I will keep you posted, and thank you so much for having me. Great.
You're very welcome.
So that's it. You've made it. The show's over. Thank you for being with us. I hope you've been able to take something away, maybe solve a problem, or just know you're not alone. Here's hoping it made you smile with a few laughs along the way. Please feel free to find me on all social media channels, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just search the Road and Morale podcast. Have an awesome day and see you next time.